and welcome to this post-holiday episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And we'll get on to the episode. We're doing an influencers episode in a second, but we've both been away on holidays and various things. Gareth, what have you been up to?
I've been in Brittany with my family, enjoying seafood and sunshine and wine.
And actually, I think you've got a family that's quite tired at home right now.
I do.
Join me tonight in our house to do the recording. And I've just got back from holiday as well. So we've had a couple of weeks away on a nice hot beach, doing all sorts of exciting things, but it's nice to be back. We hope all the listeners have enjoyed some of the earlier episodes. And if you enjoyed those ones, then there's loads and loads of episodes to go back and look for. So we're pleased to be back. Also, we should point out and apologise. I know the recording quality for our road trip wasn't as good as we'd hoped. We tried to do some recording in car, so we're back to normal place, and so hopefully the quality will be a bit better going forward.
Yeah, but we'll learn some lessons and work on that.
Look at that.
What about your holiday? Where have you been?
Oh well, we went to Jamaica. Jamaica is a fantastic.
Very nice.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and we did the thing where rather than stick to the hotel, it's one of these all-inclusive on the beach kind of a thing. What we enjoyed most was sort of driving around the island and seeing some places that perhaps tourists wouldn't normally see. Jamaica's a beautiful, beautiful country, and actually it was nice to sort of drive through the mountains. One note, anyone driving through Jamaica, is there are a lot of potholes, and we hit a lot of potholes. 3 times the windscreen washer was set off because we hit a pothole. That's how big the potholes were.
Right.
And the polite gentleman, as we handed the hire car back in, said, "Your tyres look a bit dodgy." And I gently pointed out, I think on this island, that's considered wear and tear. So good holiday. Everyone's relaxed, recuperated. Now, second half of the year, back to work and back to focus.
Excellent. Good. Well, we've got some good guests hopefully lined up. I've been sort of emailing away in the margins of my holiday, so yeah, hopefully we'll get back into this.
I think there's even some road trip guests as well, where we'll actually meet them out and about.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, but let's get back to this one. This is influencers episode, and I thought, what better than to pick about as divisive a character as you could find. So today we're going to talk about Margaret Thatcher.
It was inevitable, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it probably was inevitable, but as I did the research and I learned a bit more, it was, and I know we say this almost every time, what you think you know about someone, it turns out there's more detail, there's more nuance. Now, I was born in the early 70s, and so I grew up at sort of peak Thatcher time and saw her decline. And so there's a few things you remember about her, but there's lots that perhaps you don't remember as much. And as I say, divisive in terms of there are some people that says she was the worst prime minister ever.
Yeah.
And there are some people that say she was the best prime minister ever. Either way, there are some really interesting and frankly groundbreaking, unique things about her.
Yeah, actually, I'm quite interested in this one because a little bit younger than you. I just about remember Margaret Thatcher being Prime Minister at the end of her tenure.
Yeah.
But I don't know a huge amount beyond what everybody knows. So divisive, known as the Iron Lady. You either blame her for all of the economic ills of the 80s and 90s, or you credit her with all the progress that the country made, and I don't have a particularly strong view either way.
And as we try to do, this is not so much a political thing. This is more about history. Yeah. So here you go. Here's a little bit of a glimpse of what we're going to cover: the Falklands War, the Cold War and the relationship with the US.
They're both things I do know something about.
Well, we'll come on to that. Women's power and nicknames.
Okay.
Poll tax riots.
Yeah.
And poll tax. A changing economy. And get this, interest rates of 15%. Did you know interest rates were at 15% then?
I was aware they were very high double digit in the late 70s,
early 70s as we went down.
Right.
Northern Ireland troubles,
Yeah.
fascination attempts,
Yeah.
road to peace, privatization, mass unemployment, power dressing. So interesting as I was doing the research, people on both the left and the right claim her, which I thought was just the most bizarre thing. So Alice Weidel, who's the leader of the German AfD, regularly declares Thatcher to be a role model. And people are going, see, I told you, she's a right-winger. Geert Wilders, leaders of Holland's most popular party, the PVV, claiming that Thatcher is his greatest political role model. Again, more to the right. Donald Trump, well, that's fine. But he's said to see Margaret Thatcher as his true political inspiration. That's according to Steve Bannon. I'm not sure whether I believe it. Okay. I don't know he's going any, but that's interesting.
I heard somebody describe Donald Trump's understanding of policy as, if you talk about lakes and oceans of knowledge, he is he is the liquid you can get into a contact lens. So I'm not sure.
No, I'm not sure. I probably shouldn't have included. But now let's go all the way to the left. Do you remember Yanis Varoufakis? I think that's the correct. So he is the ex-Greek finance minister,
isn't he?
Very left-wing. And he spent half of his life opposing Thatcher. But by 2016, at the Hay Festival, he admitted he had come to admire much a better character. So interesting, both divisive and bringing people together. So before we talk about Margaret Thatcher herself, I think it's really important. Leaders are to some degree made and broken by their context. So if you took Margaret Thatcher on her own, that's mildly interesting. But if you start to talk about what was going on in the world when she came to power, when she was growing up, that's actually, frankly, quite terrifying. I think we all think in every age that we have the market on terrible things going on around the world. We say, things have never been as bad. Here we go. The economic situation in the UK. The first thing, stagflation. The UK faced high inflation with a stagnant economy and high unemployment. Not great. Industrial decline. So this is sort of in the late 60s and then the 70s. And public sector challenges. Coal mining, steel and manufacturing. Remember that thing that we don't have now?
Offshoring.
We had that thing and it was declining. And you can imagine that was leading to economic problems and social unrest. I mean, you think about this. We've just recently had the coal mine, the steelworks in Port Talbot. And that was a huge thing in the news. Imagine when there was a whole industry and the industry was being decimated. And the public sector, again, we talk about the trains right now. We talked a lot more about the trains. Public sector was seen as bloated and inefficient. Frequent strikes, labour disputes, and it was those nationalised industries. So we're very good at saying, these privatised industries are terrible. We've come 180 degrees because we were saying we need privatised industry because of this terrible. Labour government, so obviously not Margaret Thatcher, but the Labour government under James Callaghan was really struggling with economic issues, and that there was huge public dissatisfaction. And then in the winter of 78 and 79, it was known as the winter of discontent, where there were strikes by public sector workers, there was disruptions, and in fact, electricity was turned off. There were certain times when there were planned blackouts.
Like the 4-day weeks.
4-day weeks. So actually, in terms of an economic situation, you could argue pretty dire. Really quite bad. Okay. At this point, the world says, hold my beer, because the world is a dangerous place. That was the time of Soviet nuclear threat. We were going to fight the Russians at some point. Everyone was pretty sure of this. And that was unless they launched the nuclear weapons first. And we all did the, hide behind the sofa and wait for the nuclear weapon to go off and all that kind of stuff. So Cold War was hotter than it had ever been in the 70s and going into the 80s. There was huge tension and there was an arms race. So the military actually was large. We had a significant army in Germany, and the war was nearly going hot. In fact, in when was Able Archer? 1981?
I want to say 83.
In the early 80s, there was an exercise called Able Archer, and it was an exercise by the NATO armies in Germany, and it was practicing for repelling a Russian or a Warsaw Pact threat. The problem was the Russians thought we were going to war. We were going to preempt and go to war. So this was pretty bad. And I remember growing up, genuinely lying in bed at night thinking, I don't think I want to live in a nuclear war. So again, massive threats. Okay, UK's relationship with the European community. We joined the European community in 73, and there was an ongoing debate about the nature of a relationship. I don't have that go exactly, but anyway, but it started even then, this idea of should we be a part of the European community? Should we not? What does it look like?
I think it's worth recognising as well that we quite often talk about these things in separation. So we've talked about the economic situation at home, we've talked about the geopolitical security situation, we've now started to talk about the foreign policy from an economic position, but these things are all related.
100%.
And I think one of the challenges is, and we'll get on to Margaret Thatcher, but one of the challenges is about both making the right decisions when these things are related and it's complex and it's uncertainty and it's strategy and all of it, but also when you've got an electorate and a general public that don't have a deep understanding of economics, that don't necessarily have a day-to-day understanding of geopolitical politics and national security. And in fact, a lot of national security is hidden from the public very deliberately. And I was listening to a chat today with David Davis, the former, he's still a serving Tory MP, and talking about, he's clearly a very Eurosceptic, pro-Brexit, elder statesman, but talking about the complexities of foreign policy when it comes to understanding what is best for the nation in terms of economic and security and how those things interrelate. And we are absolutely in the world of then strategy, and it's leadership through communication and navigating complex challenges whilst also keeping people with you in that decision making.
I mean, I've got a list of other things. I'm not going to go into them. Oil crisis in the 70s, shift towards neoliberalism. So deregulation, privatization, free market, new powers, China, BRICS. So social movements, civil rights, gender equality, environment, all of these things. I mean, I don't know whether this is right or not. I think that's worse than we are now. I think the breadth and depth of the complexity and the change, while I recognise there's change now, I would not want to be a leader dropped in the middle of this.
No.
That's a lot of things to deal with, and many of which are direct and imminent threats now from the military side of things. So there's a lot there. Now, let's go back to Margaret Thatcher. This I loved as a fact, and I had to go and check this a couple of times. So before Margaret Thatcher took power, it was the Callaghan government. And in the time of his government, there were 30 cabinet members. Would you like to guess how many women were in his cabinet over that time? And so the largest number could be 30, and the smallest number could obviously be 0.
So this is up to, 1975?
Yeah, something like that.
So not a particularly progressive time in British politics.
Yeah.
1, 2
is the right answer. One is Shirley Williams.
I didn't know that.
But the reason why that was so interesting to me was, first of all, it tells you a lot about politics at that time.
Yeah.
It tells you a lot about the opportunity for women in politics and in leadership. And for Margaret Thatcher to go on to become the next prime minister, that's pretty staggering in terms of a change around.
I'm also imagining, as we're on the topic of diversity of cabinet, they were all of a certain age and probably all of a certain ethnicity.
But they were, and it was interesting because, and I think I've got this as some detail later, of course, many of them, they were white men.
Yeah.
And many of them had been in the military. I don't know whether I've got this detail later on, but there's some outrageous thing of the people in her cabinet, a significant percentage had bravery medals from the Second World War.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. So anyway, I mean, the point being is Margaret Thatcher comes in, but she became Prime Minister in 79. That's a pretty difficult time. And I thought about this, and I really do think, I think she inherited the most challenging problem since World War II. I mean, clearly World War II was a problem, but there was sort of this growth and then this decline. I think this was really challenging. So let's go back. Her early career. I think this is the one fact that most people know. We were talking just before we started. You said this before we started. You sort of quoted this fact back to me. So she was born October the 13th, 1925, and she grew up in Grantham in Lincolnshire, the daughter of a local alderman, Alfred Roberts, who owned a tobacconist's and a grocery shop. It was probably a grocery shop that was tobacco. Anyway, he was a shop owner. I bet everyone's got their view already listening to her. Either, oh, you know, she's this strong woman that became a leader, or, oh, she was a dreadful woman, she did this. Here's your first fact that I suspect you won't have known. In 1938, before the Second World War, a family gave sanctuary to a teenage Jewish girl who had escaped from Nazi Germany. And this was a pen friend of her elder sister, Muriel. Margaret Thatcher saved pocket money to help pay for the teenager's journey. And you can,
wow,
as you start to see actually socially what she believed, that was, I mean, why wouldn't she help someone? But it's interesting, you think you wouldn't have immediately thought that was sort of the social conscience. She was brought up as a Wesleyan Methodist, and she attended the Finkin Street Methodist Church. But, and again, second fact that's quite fun, as Margaret goes on to be a scientist, you'll be unsurprised to know she was a bit more sceptical.
Chemist, wasn't she?
She was a chemist.
Yeah.
We'll come on to some details there. And she told a friend that she could not believe in angels. Why? Because she had calculated they would need a breastbone 6 feet wide to support the wings that they would be needed to fly. I love that. I don't believe in angels. I don't believe in this religion stuff, probably. And why? Because the scientific method tells me that's not possible.
It's a very literal interpretation.
A very, very literal interpretation.
Yeah.
But I think that...
But I like it.
Well, there's a sense of this is not a woman who is going to just accept what she is told and how she does it. So, unsurprisingly, you'll think, given what she achieved, she won a scholarship. Scholarship? Yeah, it's that glass of wine. A scholarship to Grantham's Girls' Grammar School. She worked hard. She played the piano, did field hockey, did poetry recitals, swimming and walking. And little echoes of the future, head girl in 42, 43. So just think about this. She was at school during the Second World War.
Yeah.
And while the Second World War was going on, she volunteered as a fire watcher in the AIP service. Again, wow, no one thinks about it. There's a sense of service here as well. She was then accepted for a scholarship and studied at Somerville College, Oxford, near us. And she studied chemistry, as you said. She is a smart, hardworking person.
Yeah.
I mean, I always worry when I look at this and you sort of say, oh, well, she's clever, so she must have been hardworking. Actually, there were lots of these pointers that she worked really, really hard.
I mean, we've had prime ministers recently who are arguably clever but aren't very
hardworking. I think that's true. She received a prize at school. We're going back a bit, when she was 9 years old, and asked if she'd been lucky to have been given it. The future prime minister said, "I wasn't lucky. I deserved it." Again, so there's a real, you're starting to know what she is going to be like.
Driven.
She speaks the truth. She's driven, and she doesn't suffer stupid questions gladly. She was vocally proud of becoming the first prime minister with a science degree. And in fact, arguably, the reports were that she was more proud of being first prime minister with a science degree than she was of being the first female prime minister. So that was
interesting.
Yeah. Charles Moore, her biographer, said that when she was at Oxford, Roberts was noted for her isolated and serious attitude. She is consistent about how she does these things. She then became the president of the Oxford University Conservative Association in 1946. She was influenced by various political works, which I've not read, but it condemned economic intervention by government as a precursor to an authoritarian state. You can see where that free market economy starts to come in.
It's about the individual, not the state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Taking responsibility, and you can see that aligns with how
opportunities for people. Yeah.
So clearly, hardworking, intelligent, bit of a star. She moved to Colchester after graduating, and she worked as a research chemist for BX Plastics, and which everyone remembers, I think. In 1948, she went to Imperial Chemical Industries, better known as ICI, but was rejected. You're going to love this. I love doing these with you because you haven't heard this stuff. I can see you reacting. She was rejected after the personnel department assessed her as, quote, headstrong, obstinate, and get this, dangerously self-opinionated. An interesting mix of the person who supported refugees and is already showing her mettle and sort of her future. At 24, she's starting to think about her political future and eventually becoming a Conservative parliamentary candidate. That's when she met, in 1949, a divorcee, which again at the time I suspect was a big thing, a chap called Dennis Thatcher, who was a successful and quite wealthy businessman. We're not going to talk a lot about Dennis in this, but there's a real sense as she goes on through life that she loved Dennis dearly and family was really important to her. And in their older age, apparently she was devastated when Dennis died.
Yeah.
And so there was,
I whilst I don't want to derail you and agree that this is about Margaret Thatcher and not Dennis, I think there is possibly a reference here to followership in that, in a, as we've already alluded to, very male-dominated culture, Dennis is older and already more successful, arguably.
Yeah.
And yet, as her political career
supports her,
he absolutely not only supports her, but deliberately stayed out of the limelight. And we talked about followership on previous episodes. I think that is a possibly often overshadowed by everything else that she's done, but an act of leadership in itself.
Yeah, really interesting, and actually quite a funny chap as well. Although I suspect off the time quite racist, along with the royal family and other people saying things, but really interesting. So she's moved through school, she's moved through university, she has a professional career. By the way, the last professional career fact, do you know what she, and this might be slightly tenuous, but do you know what she is credited as having invented?
I have no idea. I mean, she did plastics and chemistry, so...
Mr. Whippy ice cream.
Really?
Her final piece of research was around emulsifiers for ice cream, and my understanding is that is the ability for you to create soft serve ice cream.
Amazing.
Or at least she was a part of that. So whether she invented Mr. Whippy, that feels a bit strong, but she was a part of that as well. So
that's amazing. There you
go. Frankly, you could stop now because I love.
Well, I was going to say, if I went to my grave having done something as,
Mr. Whippy,
life-changing as creating soft serve ice cream, I would feel like I'd achieved things in life.
Well, since I was just about to sort of dive back into the political side of things. What makes leaders want to carry on being leaders? Yeah. You've just said she's got a successful career. She achieves everything she sets her hand to notionally. She could say, I've just invented Mr. Whippy. I mean, I don't think that's what she should have said, but why do people carry on?
Yeah. And additionally, I suppose there's another question there, which is, why do they take the risk of, like I say, she had a successful career, she's clearly doing well as a chemist, at a time where, professional women were far less, well, there were less of them than there are now. She would have been seen within her social circles and have been highly successful already. So why take the risk? And I suppose it comes down to the types of people that are successful not because of what they've done, but because of who they are to get there and do it. And so it's the same reason that I think most of us look at very wealthy people and go, well, if I had all that money, I'd retire and, sail off into the sunset. And then you see multiple, entrepreneurs do multiple businesses time after time, and they keep going late into their 80s and 90s. Look at Warren Buffett is a great example of that. Why didn't he retire 30, 40, 50 years ago? Because it's in his nature.
To be fair, I think we probably have to, I mean, it'd be lovely to have Margaret here to tell us why she did these things and why she got. I have to believe that different people have different drivers.
I think
there are going to be some people that it is my duty / destiny to achieve these things in support of other people.
It's interesting that you use the word duty and the word destiny, because I think they're two very different things.
I think they are two different things, but
I suspect most people go into politics with altruistic kind of vision. Whether they stay that way, I think is a different question.
Because I think there's another. It's actually interesting. This is the fundamental nature of successful leadership, which is also motivation. And we've not really ever talked about motivation because your hypothesis is that most people who become politicians do that out of a sense of serving people. And by the way, I think that's true. I regularly have conversation with family and friends who say, all politicians are just as bad as each other, which I do not subscribe to. And
I think certainly in the UK, with our political system, which I think is an incredibly strong institution and we should be rightfully very proud of. I think in other systems where it is a power grab or there is an opportunity for a power grab, maybe that's slightly different. But if you consider that you go through that process of being a parliamentary candidate, you have to probably do a lot of knocking on doors and street walking just to get your name known within the party to even be considered as an MP. So it would be highly unrealistic to sort of think that Margaret Thatcher at the age of 24 went, do you know what, I'm going to be Prime Minister. Let's do it.
Well, funny you should say that.
I suspect, given her character and what we know already, that is always an option until the door's closed. But it would be highly unrealistic to go, I'm a chemist, but I'm going to be Prime Minister, so I'll do a career change. There must be a sense of duty, a sense of and whether that's driven by she needs to help others or whether it's I've got something to give, I don't know.
I mean, I'm going to reach now, but I wonder whether that she was growing up as a generation where duty and service, the Second World War having just happened, was at the very least a part of the national vernacular.
Yes.
Whereas today, and this is not me denigrating people, but I don't think we don't talk about service in the same way.
Well, I think that the Second World War is clearly a huge cultural
because it impacted everyone,
absolutely.
And everyone was affected, and everyone had to do their bit. And so I think that
Margaret Thatcher's, her generation, their parents had to do their bit. They were the children who witnessed that, were part of it. As you said, she volunteered herself. Duty was very much part of the conversation, part of the expectation. I think where we are now is perhaps we haven't been put under the crisis, the national crisis pressure. I mean, you could argue things like the COVID pandemic tested us. And
the COVID pandemic was actually the closest in that sense because, it affected everyone and people we knew were volunteering as doctors and nurses.
And I think it engendered more of a sense of duty amongst us than we had previously. And that has continued a bit. There are echoes of that. But nowhere near to the same extent.
No, I mean it's a topic maybe we should come back to because I think I think you and I have an old-fashioned sense of great leaders are serving, and that may or may not be true. I mean, you could argue some of our recent prime ministers were doing it. People might have suggested out of a sense of raw power. And there are people in America right now that you might suggest are looking for leadership in a sense of raw power.
Yeah, I think there's also this thing about whether you think you have a vision of what's right and wrong and you feel like you want to contribute as part of that, or whether you just think that you're better and have something clear to offer. And I think I listened to an interview with Liz Truss. We talked about it not long ago, where she came across astoundingly arrogant. And I get the impression that she thought she could be the Prime Minister because she knew things other people didn't, and the country needed her. Whereas you look at some other leaders, and perhaps Margaret Thatcher is one of those, we'll get into it, where you get the impression that because of a sense of duty, they feel like they want to make a change. They have it's a subtle difference.
It really is, but it's the question that I'll leave us with before we go to the break is, if you are a leader who has, for want of a better word, selfish goals. In other words, I want to be leader because I want to have power.
Legacy, notoriety, power.
Yes.
Can
you be a good leader? Anyway, I'll leave that.
Question. I think objectively you probably can. I think it's just going to be far less likely.
I think that's maybe, you know what, there you go. We don't need to do an episode. We've answered that question in one go. All right, well, look, let's come back after the break. We'll trot through the entry into politics, which is interesting, but it's more the story, more of what she's done before. But anyway, let's come back straight after the break and talk about how she's really moving into politics and her path to the premiership.
Wonderful.
Welcome back. Well, after me thinking I had a deep and serious question around, can you be a great leader if you're not a pure, serving, selfless person? And your answer was, yeah, probably.
Well, yes. I mean,
sorry, I'm misrepresenting what you.
No, you're not. I quite flippantly said yes. I think there's a whole discussion in there. I think in the right circumstances, those traits could be useful, but it would have to be the right circumstance. And I think my gut says there are going to be far more great leaders who.
It is easier if you have selfless reasons. Yeah. We'll come back another time. 1950 and 1951, Margaret Roberts, then we keep talking about Roberts because she was born Roberts, was the Conservative candidate for the Labour seat of Dartford. So she was going against Labour. They selected her as the candidate. Although she wasn't a dynamic speaker, quote, she was well prepared and fearless in her answers. And the prospective candidate, Bill Deeds, recalled, once she opened her mouth, the rest of us began to look rather second rate. I think she'd have quite liked that phrase. She was supported by parents and Dennis, and she married Dennis in 51. And then, so I should have asked you this trick question. What was Margaret Thatcher's professional qualifications? So we've decided she's a scientist.
Yeah.
And she is I
don't know.
Come on, Margaret Thatcher. She's clever. She studied to be a barrister. She studied the law.
Yes, I did know.
Because, having invented Mr. Whippy, there's nothing left in science to do.
Well, now you need to protect the patents around Mr. Whippy.
Exactly. Yeah. That's what she did. She qualified as a barrister in 1953 and specialised in taxation. She is not a one-trick pony.
No.
I think that's, again, given her political aspirations, that's a person that can do a lot.
Yeah.
It took until 1959 for her to be elected, and she became a member of Parliament for Finchley. But by 1960, within the first year, she'd already proposed and sponsored legislation that had become law. And in 1961, again, showing her that she was her own woman, she'd voted against the Conservative Party's official position by voting for the restoration of birching as a judicial corporate punishment. So just before we go down the Saint Margaret Thatcher, okay.
Is that the path we were taking?
I don't know, but it was, I was building this idea of someone who looked after refugees but you're going to see she's a woman of contradiction in these sentences.
Yeah. So here's a quick question. Given that we've indicated that she's headstrong, she's clearly aware of her own talents, but she's also a little bit dour, a little bit introverted, perhaps, and perhaps maybe I'm sort of adding my own narrative here, but perhaps not the most fun at parties.
Yep.
Do you think she would have been successful in today's political climate with social media, 24-hour news cycles, the need to be charismatic? Would she have made it through?
I think she would.
Okay.
And I think she would because she was genuine. And I think today, genuineness or an appearance of genuineness is highly prized. People can overturn.
Even if she's genuinely stern and genuinely
yes,
boring.
100%.
Okay.
Look at Donald Trump, and people said, well, he might be a horrible human being, but he says what we're thinking. He's not afraid to say these things. By the way, just before we go further forward, I could not have planned this better. Literally, the next line in my notes, and you're going to feel bad about this, and you should, Gareth. I'm wagging my finger. You can't see this. And I talked about the fact that as people were starting to say, this person's going to be prime minister. You know, go back to that quote about we look stupid, we look second rate. And as late as 1970, she said, quote, there will not be a woman prime minister in my lifetime. The male population is too prejudiced. She would be spinning in a grave what you just said, Gareth. I hope you feel terrible. Well, that wasn't what you said. And again, I'm teasing him. He's got a hurt look on his face.
Yeah, I absolutely wasn't thinking about the fact that she was a female. It was literally about the characteristic of being stern. And I think that could apply just as much.
Sorry, there was too much of an opportunity with you saying.
Yeah, fair enough.
Do you think
make me out to be a horrible misogynist?
Exactly.
Let's move on.
He's not. I have to say this, terrible, but he's not. So let's go back. It's 1961. She's voted for the restoration of Birching. She's now an MP.
Yeah.
She's promoted to the front bench as parliamentary secretary for the Ministry for Pensions by Harold Macmillan. So she is on the up. She was the youngest woman in history to receive such a post. Clearly, trajectory.
Yeah.
She has this really interesting mix of ideas. So as I've just said, 1961, she votes for the restoration of Birching. I think it was, I can't remember if it was 1961 or maybe a little bit later. She was one of the few Conservative MPs to support a bill to decriminalise male homosexuality.
Okay.
Yeah. So Birching, fine. Yeah. Homosexuality, fine.
So progressive and yet regressive.
Yeah, but I think, I suspect she's voting with her heart. These are the views that she has, and she's honest. She's not fitting the stereotype of, I've been told, particularly going against her own party.
She's not just following the whip.
Yeah, she voted in favour of David Steele's bill to legalise abortion and a ban on hair coursing. Oh, we're back to Mother Teresa again now. She's doing what we might think of as liberal things. But supported the retention of capital punishment and voted against the relaxation of divorce laws. So I don't know what to make of that, but that's an interesting mix of views. To be fair, and this is a thing that we do too much these days, actually, I'm going to sort of chastise myself. We're very quick to argue when MPs vote for or against a bill.
Yes.
And we actually don't have any context on the bill or the reason or whipping process or whatever. So when we say MPs voted to put effluents into rivers, I think most MPs would say, oh, no, I don't support effluents in rivers, but I voted because of these. Anyway, that's
absolutely.
She went to the US in 1967, and the internal reports they wrote says she can be prime minister. So the Americans are thinking, okay, she can be prime minister. Okay, here we go. Now we're going left and right in terms of liberal, not liberal. 1968. Enoch Powell delivers his Rivers of Blood speech.
Yeah.
So we hear about that today, Rivers of Blood. He strongly criticises Commonwealth immigration to the United Kingdom and proposes the Race Relations Bill. I can't remember from my notes whether that was Margaret or Enoch Powell. Someone's going to be screaming at the podcast.
Yeah.
But in a 1991 interview for Today, Thatcher stated she thought Powell had made, quote, a valid argument, if in sometimes regrettable terms.
Yeah, there's echoes there, isn't there, of current politicians sort of saying similar things. And we've just gone through a very tumultuous and tragic period in the UK of race riots, and anti-immigration riots. And there is a lot of dog whistling, and there is a lot of, well, of course the violence is abhorrent, but they've got a point, and it sounds very similar, and
Well, but it could also be the element that says, and by the way, I agree about the dog whistling. And frankly, I was on holiday when these riots began, and it was the most shameful thing I could imagine. This is not the Britain I love and it stands for. But actually, the good news is then a few days later, the Britain I care about and love showed itself when four right-wing thugs were surrounded by thousands of people playing accordions and dancing in Brighton. That's the kind of country I want to stand for. But anyway, this idea that you can talk about difficult topics.
Yeah.
I actually think she's the kind of person who says, I don't have time for the emotion about this. We should talk. She's a pragmatic problem solver. I want to talk about it.
I get the impression she is that kind of person, but that isn't what that quote says.
I know. Well, interestingly,
and that quote effectively says he's a bit rough around the edges, but he's got a point. And that, I think, is playing to the oversimplification of the. If she said these are really complex issues, and there's arguments on either side, and we need to have an open, honest discussion and debate, rather than he just said it clumsily, but he's right, or he's got a point. It feels uncomfortable to me.
Yeah. I think context is important here, but I'm not
absolutely.
Okay, here we go. Pop quiz. What was Margaret Thatcher's nickname?
The Iron Lady.
Hold
but it wasn't at this point.
It was not at this point.
No. So is that what you're asking? What is it at this point?
No, see, you're ruining my shtick. I'm trying to get you to come up with the incorrect. We'll come on to the. Do you know?
Well, there's Maggie Thatcher, the milk snatcher.
Very good.
Yeah.
Or did you just read my notes?
No. No.
That's very good. So
is that where you're going with it?
Yeah. So she abolished free milk for school children aged 7 to 11.
Yes.
And quote, cabinet papers later revealed that she opposed the policy but been forced into it by the Treasury. Anyway, she got the nickname Margaret Thatcher Milk Snatcher. I think, as we've been talking about the US elections, I've been listening to lots of podcasts, which weirdly my family listened to as well when we were in the car, which I didn't understand. Even my youngest, who's 13 and not very interested in politics, said, put that back on, Dad. But anyway.
We listened to a lot of Disney.
Did you listen to a lot of Disney? I see. We listened to a lot of politics.
My daughters are a lot younger.
Okay, but they'll get to the politics. But the point I was trying to make was they were saying something really interesting, which just hadn't occurred to me in the political world, but I think this is true of the leadership world. And they were saying Kamala Harris needs to create her narrative before Donald Trump can do it for her.
Yeah.
And it was it just hadn't occurred to me that there was this race to create your narrative because you don't want the other person to make it for you. And so this idea of Margaret Thatcher Milk Snatcher, the power of these names.
Yeah.
People forget everything else and they remember these nicknames. But of course, because she's Margaret Thatcher, the nickname is replaced very soon by another, which I'll come back to it. But just in terms of her power of communication, and we talked about how really important communication is as great leaders. You can be a fantastic leader, but if you don't have this power to communicate and this power to sort of connect with people, actually you're losing a huge chunk of your ability to be successful. Yeah. And Clive James, who some of our older listeners might remember. Do you remember Clive James?
Vaguely.
Clive James on television, Sunday night, hilarious. But he wrote in The Observer, prior to her election as the Conservative Party leader, he compared her voice in 1973 to a cat sliding down a blackboard. So interesting. And she'd already started to work on our presentation. Yeah. And in the end, Laurence Olivier, arguably the greatest actor of, the second half of the 20th century, arranged lessons for her with the National Theatre's voice coach. So even she recognized that presentation, communication is important.
There's so many echoes with what is currently happening, aren't there? Because when you talk about Donald Trump trying to create Kamala Harris's narrative, he's currently trying to ridicule her laugh, and he keeps referring to it as the cackle. And it seems like a very, very similar kind of insult. Now, that isn't,
connecting.
Thankfully,
it isn't
connecting and gaining traction, because I think people are just bored of these
Well, as a electorate, we're
but
pretty bad that when someone has an image that is created, and we've seen this through the years, Neil Kinnock falling over.
yeah,
I mean, again, you're a bit young for this, but this was when he was the
Theresa
leader of the
May's
Labour Party.
dancing.
Theresa May's dancing.
Yeah.
These things stick. Anyway, let's go back. The power of image. I mean, this is actually neatly going on. So her nickname, as you rightly pointed out, was the Iron Lady. And you think about that today, the words Margaret Thatcher typically go with the words Iron Lady. Do you know why she was called the Iron Lady?
It was the Russian or the Soviets that I can't remember which Soviet, but somebody like Gorbachev or somebody nicknamed her the Iron Lady.
You are exactly right. Well done. You score points. The Soviet Army Journal, so that's Red Star.
Yeah.
You knew that though, Gareth. Reported her stance in a piece headlined "The Iron Lady Raises Fears." And they were talking about her remarks about the Iron Curtain.
Yeah.
And the Sunday Times covered the article the next day, and Margaret Thatcher embraced that. And in a speech to the Finchley Conservatives, she talked about, she likened herself to the Duke of Wellington's name, the Iron Duke, and she said, quote, "I stand before you tonight in my Red Star chiffon evening gown, my face softly made up and my fair hair gently waved, the Iron Lady of the Western world, a Cold War warrior, a Peking plotter." Now, either she wrote some great words or she had some really good people. Fantastic, though, this idea that she's going to take something which was designed to be an insult, and it's one of the most memorable things about her. The Iron Lady is not for turning. There's a strong brand there. You go back to Donald Trump liking her. Donald Trump likes strong people. And of all the people he likes, she was not the dictator. She was an elected member, but she was so strong. So that was interesting. 75, she becomes leader of the opposition, and in 79, a general election gives her a parliamentary majority of 44 seats. She arrives on 4th of May 1979 at Downing Street, and she paraphrases a prayer of St. Francis. This is, again, quite a famous speech. "Where there is discord, we may bring harmony. Where there is error, we may bring truth. Where there is doubt, we may bring faith. And where there is despair, we may bring hope." Strong words. This is what I'm going to do. So I wanted to touch on a couple of some really key moments, because I think, again, as always with these things, it's a little bit of a trot through the history, and you kind of already know where this is going. So maybe these facts and these information, this is sort of really, really important. The miners' strike. This was huge. Again, growing up, I remember this is what was on the news. When we talk about riots, that was what we were seeing on the television each night with the riots. So she wanted to turn Britain from a dependent, self-reliant society to a do-it-yourself nation. She focused on privatizing state-owned industry, and steel and coal were state-owned industries. Can you believe that? Steel and coal was obviously a hangover from the Second World War.
Strategic industries.
She wanted to get rid of the government subsidies to make it a free market, and she wanted to curb the power of the trade unions.
It's interesting, isn't it, when you say that, and you say, well, it's a hangover from the Second World War, but we've already said this is the height of the Cold War. And so it's quite radical to think about nationalising what are considered strategic industries. The reason that we need to keep coal and steel is not just to keep the lights on and build rovers, it's to build tanks and ships. It's to be able to ramp back up if and when we go to war with the Soviets. So looking back, you go, well, she privatised and we moved into a service industry and it was the right economic choices. At the time, that is quite radical thinking.
It's enormously radical thinking. And I think it was, so to be clear, the last Conservative Prime Minister, Edward Heath, his government had fallen because of the power of the unions, because of the strife it was calling. And this was the time of Arthur Scargill, who now people don't hear of, but he was the president of the National Union of Mine Workers.
I once worked with a warrant officer in the Royal Artillery who went to Moscow in 1978 with Arthur Scargill, and he went as a school child
That's
on a Friends of the Union trip to the Soviet
fascinating.
Union. Yeah,
At the time, do you know how many working coal mines we had?
hundreds.
170.
Wow.
How many people
Yeah.
did it employ?
Well, each coal mine's got to be a couple of thousand.
190,000 people.
Yeah.
So huge. Arthur Scargill estimated that the plans to cut back and to privatize, make it more efficient, they would lose 20,000 jobs, they thought. Close 20 pits and lose 20,000 jobs. And Scargill called a national strike. But unlike in the 70s, when the government had fallen, Margaret Thatcher took steps to stockpile enough coal and coke at the time, which was needed, to keep the country supplied for 6 months. So that was the point at which the police were against the striking coal miners, and the violence started. That's when the clashes started, and at the time, and I'm not close enough to know, but everything I've read talks about the fact that she explicitly saw this as an opportunity to crush the militant labour unions for good.
Yeah.
And I think we look at where we are today, unions don't have the same influence they have. I remember watching Carry On. It was about making toilets.
Right.
And this Carry On film from it must have been late 70s, early 80s. And it was all about when they were working, the slightest thing in the unions would call a strike.
Yeah.
So it was so interesting that even in culture, there was this sense of, could you stop striking, please? This is unreasonable. She was going to really fight back against that.
And I think it's interesting that a perception, and perhaps the common perception of that, is that's Margaret Thatcher making a power grab. But I suspect, from what we know about her,
she felt this was the way that things had to be successful.
A rebalancing of the constitution, a rebalancing of democratic system because it was broken.
Well, and I think it's easy to also conflate a number of these things. So people would say, you put all these people out of work.
Yeah.
These industries are gone forever. But other people would say, but this was the rebalancing because they were not profitable. The country was paying for these things. So interesting. But I think
you can see straight away how these become very polarizing issues. If you are in a coal mine community,
she is the devil,
then this is really hurting. This is really affecting.
Well, here you go. Yeah. In 2014, declassified documents revealed that she was ready to call out the military. So really, this is a person who was set in that way. And they, by the way, call out the military to transport food, coal, and potentially, if she had to, a state of emergency.
Yeah.
In South Yorkshire, they saw some of the worst violence. On June the 18th, 1984, there were 10,000 miners facing off against 5,000 police officers, just to give you a sense of the violence.
Yes.
51 miners and 72 police officers were injured, which became later known as the Battle of Orgreave. On March the 3rd, 1985, Scargill and the NUM voted to end the strike after 362 days. Brass bands paraded and colourful flags accompanied many of the miners back to work as they put a brave face on defeat. There was no settlement. Thatcher's government had not made a single concession. So, to your point, there are many people that would say that was a dreadful, dreadful thing that the government did. There are others who would say it was a necessary rebalance because these weren't profit-making industries, and as we know, rebalance of you can't have old industries just because old industries support people.
Yeah,
hugely, and I'm sure someone will be disappointed when I say this, brave move. There was power of conviction, 362 days and no convictions. That either makes you the devil incarnate, or it makes you someone committed to transformation.
Yeah, and I think the difficulty becomes when you talk about bravery, it's within the context of political pressure, political decision making. But of course, that is contrasted with the coal mining communities who are struggling to put bread on the table. And so what objectively is a complex issue about strategy, national strategy for the long term, becomes conflated with very, very visceral, emotional challenges. But that's politics. And it's I started when you started this podcast saying I don't have a particularly strong view either way, because I can see why people are emotional from both sides. I think it would be dangerous to sort of go down the counterfactual history route of saying there's another better way of doing this. So I'm kind of torn in that these are really difficult things that led to a lot of people suffering, which is never what a leader should be aiming to do.
But sometimes a leader has to do.
But these are difficult challenges that have to be overcome for the long-term security of the nation.
Well, let's move on to one which, I mean, I think the miners' strike and the results of it and the conduct of it for a year, there is huge division in terms of people's views on Margaret Thatcher. But let's flip it around. You said about the decisions you have to make to keep the country safe, the Falklands War.
Yeah.
That's the one which I think many people remember her for.
Yeah.
And that is 1982, the Argentinian military junta invades the Falkland Islands. And at that point, we should remember Margaret Thatcher's political future was in question.
Yeah.
You know, there was discontent about what she'd done. Her time was passing. Savage government spending cuts, declining manufacturing industry, high employment. She was going to go. And the reality is that Thatcher's decision to go to war to recover the islands actually saved her. But it was against several members of parliament and close advisors. Now, I did some research, actually. I did some research. That's very grand. I looked at lots of articles. There is a suggestion that the British Army said it is not possible for us to take the Falklands.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll come back to that a little bit later. You're not going to believe who the hero was. Brackets, it's the Royal Navy, but close brackets, we'll come back to that.
I feel like we have a slightly biased...
It's very biased. Marines, Royal Navy, but that's okay. As long as we say it up front, we declare our interest, that's okay. She was quoted as saying, when you're at war, you cannot allow the difficulties to dominate your thinking. You have to set out with an iron will to overcome them. She wrote that in the Downing Street Years, her 1993 memoir.
Yeah.
And anyway, what was the alternative? That a Commonweal Garden dictator should rule over the Queen's subjects and prevail by fraud and violence, not while I was Prime Minister. Those sentences contain, that's a film right there. Okay, the victor gets to write the history.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't going to allow the Queen to be defeated. You see someone who says, sometimes you have to do the hard things. And you see someone saying, I'm going to say all the things which get everyone's flag waving.
And again, we have the benefit of hindsight. We have the benefit of...
at the time, people were like...
knowing how successful the task force are going to be, of knowing how history has judged the decision-making. If an Exocet missile had gone into the wrong...
carrier.
The wrong capital ship, history would judge that decision very
100%. So here you go. Here's a fact which I think you know, but you hadn't thought about. She was the first woman to lead the country into battle since Elizabeth I.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I like that. Just to be clear, I'm absolutely on her side with we did the right thing.
Yes,
And what is also not necessarily well known is that she did, and you may be going on to talk about this, pursue an awful lot of diplomatic avenues, and there was every opportunity given to the Argentinians,
correct,
within the UN and through third parties, but ultimately,
you can see me doing a big but.
Yeah.
In 1982, she wrote to the Tory MP Richard Needham defending the decision to scrap the only British warship in the vicinity of the Falklands, HMS Endurance, which arguably, not arguably, this is sort of stated, the Argentinians took to be a nudge and a wink that actually the British government would protect the Falklands. Just after the invasion, the Defence Secretary, John Knott, I remember seeing him on television when I was young. This is when I'm starting to sort of become aware of what's going on TV. He gave the MOD's view the Falklands could not be retaken. Quote, "This was terrible and totally unacceptable. I could not believe it. These were our people, our islands. I said instantly, if they are invaded, we have to go get them back. Now, everything we've learned about her makes me think that was exactly what she said.
Yeah.
That was exactly what she thought. And there was not a lot of, wow, what's the right thing for me to do?
Yeah.
This is fantastic. So I couldn't, it was referenced a couple of times, but I couldn't find the direct evidence. But the suggestion was she called the army in, and the army said, Prime Minister, I'm afraid we can't take the Falklands back. I mean, John Nott, as the MOD said. Quote, when the Chief of Naval Staff, Admiral Henry Leach, finally arrived, so this was a cabinet meeting, and Henry Leach comes in, hello, Prime Minister, sorry I'm late. And she asked, what could we do? Quote, he was quiet, calm and confident. You could just imagine what the room would have been like, the army going, what's the old buffer going to say?
Yeah.
I can put together a task force of destroyers, frigates, landing craft and support vessels. It will be led by the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible. I can be ready to leave in 48 hours.
Strong.
That, I mean, we should probably come back and talk about Henry Leach.
Yeah.
That is frankly amazing. Okay, does he know you can be ready in 48 hours? No way could he have known.
No. I've heard it described by people that were there, including Brigadier Julian Thompson, who led 3 Commando Brigade, that it was a come-as-you-are party.
And they all just piled on ship.
They literally arrived and piled in with what they got. The person who did the job that I once did in 3 Commando Brigade as the intelligence officer didn't know where the Falklands was, as I don't think many of 3 Commando Brigade or the general population would have done. And so when asked to pull together the intelligence brief within hours of this task force being declared, went to Plymouth Library and got every book from the library out that referenced the Falkland Islands. Most of them were ornithology books or books about sailing.
Hopefully if we fight the birds.
But it turns out those kind of books are really useful because weather and nature books and sailing books talk about all the types of things, and they have lots of photos in them of cliffs and beaches and all the sorts of things that Royal Marines are interested in if they're about to go mountain invasion. So
it's quite remarkable. So he needed the authority. Henry Leach has asked, give me authority. I gave it him immediately, and he left immediately to set the work in hand. We reserved for Cabinet the decision as to whether and when the task force should set sail. So the parliamentary debate, quote, this is what she said in Parliament, the people of the Falkland Islands, like the people of the United Kingdom, are an island race. They are few in number, but they have the right to live in peace, to choose their own way of life and to determine their own allegiance. Their way of life is British. Their allegiance is to the Crown. It is the wish of the British people and the duty of Her Majesty's government to do everything we can to uphold that right. That will be our hope and our endeavour, and I believe the resolve of every member of the House. Everyone stands up and claps. Lawrence Freedman notes in the official history of the Falklands campaign that she did not ignore opposition or fail to consult others. However, once a decision was reached, she did not look back. We have talked lots about leaders, confidence in decision-making, feedback from others, and then commitment to the answer. Our old friend, Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell, on announcement that the task force was sailing south, called out Mrs. Thatcher and said, quote, are you really an Iron Lady? Later, when the war was won, Enoch Powell returned to the subject in a parliamentary question. Is the Right Honourable Lady aware that the report has now been received from the public and analyst on a certain substance recently subjected to analysis, and I have obtained a copy of the report? It shows that the substance under test consisted of ferrous matter of the highest quality, and that is of exceptional tensile strength, is highly resistant to wear and tear and to stress, and may be used to advantage for all national purposes. Margaret Thatcher apparently took that quote, framed it, and placed it on a wall in her office. So really, really definitive against the belief of everyone around her. This matters. This is important to me. This is the principle. And there will be no discussion about failure. And I need people who can bring me solutions and who have that winning. When Henry Leach said 48 hours, I think, what would have happened if I was Henry Leach? I worry I'd have said, well, Prime Minister, give me 3 weeks and I might be able to get a task force ready, as opposed to Henry Leach, supported by Margaret Thatcher, going go.
Yeah. So I had a chat with somebody the other day, and we were talking about the challenges in leadership of, we constantly talk about this idea of authenticity and the importance of authenticity in leadership. And I absolutely believe in that, and I think it makes perfect sense. But we also talk about the fact that a leader needs to lead by example, motivate, inspire. And I'd never really thought about it, but leadership when things are going well is relatively easy. Management might be difficult, command might be difficult, but leadership when everything's going well and everybody's happy is easy. Leadership is really, it comes to its own when you're in crisis, when there's challenge, when things aren't going well. And this idea that you have to be authentic, but at the same time inspire, can sometimes create this conflict. And how do you drive people towards the goal, towards the mission, if you don't believe in it, without losing your authenticity? And I asked a really good friend of mine about this, and I said, what do you do? And he said, yeah, the sole aim of a leader is to provide hope and to inspire through hope. He said, and I try and do that every day, but I will never sell bullshit. And it strikes me that this is a crisis, this is difficult, this is conflicting information, and it's high risk, and it's uncertain. This is complexity at its absolute peak. And what Margaret Thatcher has done is taken all this information, and she's, quite well known for deliberately engaging in discourse with people who have different opinions. And she's got no time for people who can't back up their arguments, but lots of time for people that have different opinions and different arguments. She's taken all that, she's assimilated it, she's decided what she thinks is right, and now she's going to sell that hope. And so I suspect, and I haven't read her diaries, and I should, but I suspect there's an awful lot of things in her diaries about how uncertain it all was, and yet her role was to sell the absolute belief in the task force and the absolute necessity for this mission all the way through.
So when I was going to spend some time talking about assassination attempts, and so one of the most famous ones was at the Conservative Party conference
in Brighton.
Yeah. And if I remember rightly, one of her MP's wife was either killed or significantly injured. But there was a high chance that Margaret Thatcher would have died.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go through that, but there was some really, she spoke in Parliament. She spoke at the conference the next day. Very brave, very forthright. But going back to your point about leadership, and I think, coming back after our holidays, having time to relax and not think about this for a while, we've spent a lot of time with influencers, and in many of the influencer cases, we've said these are good things and these are bad things. I think at a high level, and I apologize, I'm going to go back to my cliched reference here, it's like baking a cake. There are these many aspects of leadership: the ability to communicate, the ability to listen to people, to absorb information, the ability to be genuine, all these things we've talked about, intelligent, hardworking, service, duty, all the things over the last 90 episodes we've talked about. But the thing that really matters is how you put all of those together. It is like a recipe. And so it's funny. It's almost like you can score a maximum of 100 as a leader and no one ever really gets there. But when you get into the 80s or 90s, we think of you as a great leader. Now, that doesn't mean you're perfect and doesn't mean you have it all. But actually, the most successful leaders actually have the most of these elements they manage to sort of put together. And in the case of Elon Musk, who is increasingly nutty, I think we even said this, we're very prescient when we said, how will people talk about him in years to come? He had many of these, but in some areas he was stronger, in some areas he was weaker. And now you can see he's actually very weak in some of these areas. Margaret Thatcher scores quite highly in lots of these different things, seeing that communication wasn't a strength. But frankly, some of these speeches, both public and private, are very strong. Conviction, all these things. So it's really difficult. So I wanted to finish on a on a couple of more fun anecdotes, and just because I think she had a sense of humor as well. That's another one of my little things. Maybe we should do an episode on what are the categories that I think contribute to being a great leader. So the first one was around in 1997 at the Conservative Party conference. I think this was very much at the end of her time.
Yeah.
British Airways were redesigning their logos, their tail logo.
Yeah, I remember that.
So it was originally a flag, very clear, and it went through a period where it said we're the world's favorite airline. And so the tails were all different images from around the world. Famously, she was standing in front of, I think it was Concorde, with lots of proud people from British Airways going, fly the flag, British Airways. And she took out a tissue and she placed it over the tail of the aeroplane.
Right.
And you can imagine the PR people would have gone nuts, but that was like, no, British Airways, British flag. I thought that was fantastic. Edwina Currie, not my favourite minister, bearing in mind she's gone further to the right. But when she was a junior health minister under Thatcher, she remembered her Margaret Thatcher's attitude to a government. And her attitude was, quote, I presume this is a quote from Margaret Thatcher, I don't mind what my ministers say, as long as they do what I tell them. Sense of humour. And Thatcher briefly joined the campaign of prospective Tory MP Michael Brown in 1979. And when he joined Parliament successfully, she asked him how the election had gone. And he said, I got 31,500 votes and a majority of 486, he told her proudly. She replied, no, Michael, I got you 31,000. You got 486. Excellent. So, really, sense of humour there as well. So, in conclusion, I mean, there's loads more. When I looked at sort of the seminal moments, we didn't talk about her relationship with Ronald Reagan and the US.
No, we haven't.
These are things we sort of touched on at the beginning.
Yeah.
Is she the most hated prime minister? And there will be people that will confidently tell you. In fact, there are literally articles why Margaret Thatcher is the most hated prime minister. She supported the retention of capital punishment. She destroyed Britain's manufacturing industry, and policies led to mass unemployment. She presided over interest rates of 15%. She abolished free milk for school children. The decline of the North, the manufacturing industry, the employment in the North in manufacturing industry slumped from 7.1 million in 1979 to 4.4 million in 1993.
Yeah.
The poll tax,
huge,
which was, they named riots after them, poll tax riots. Section 28. So Thatcher's arguable, quiet homophobia, maybe not. Irish hunger strikes, we didn't talk about the Irish trouble. So, oh my word, there are people who say she's most hated. Flip it around, why people think she's most admired. This straight from a Guardian article, by the way. Privatization. This was the first time ordinary people could buy shares in British Gas.
Yep.
I remember the TV campaign, if you see Sid, tell him that there's gas shares.
Right.
She called it people's capitalism, giving ordinary people control. 4 million people applied for shares in British Gas. Many then sold them immediately for quick profit.
Yep.
And of course, now those companies are owned by large organisations, often outside of the UK. So, but privatisation, Northern Ireland peace process. Amongst Republicans, Thatcher is loathed for intransigence during the Maze prison hunger strikes of 1981.
It's worth pointing out when you say Republican, because he's Irish Republican.
Irish Republican.
Not American Republican.
Yes.
Very different.
Yes, very different. The hunger strikes led to the death of Bobby Sands. And 4 years later, she appalled unionists by signing the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which gave the Republic of Ireland a say in the affairs. Arguably, the work she did paved the way for the Good Friday Peace Agreement.
Absolutely.
So
I don't think that's in doubt. I think,
again, fantastic education reforms. She transformed the state school system.
Yeah.
Kenneth Baker, her education secretary, insisted that attainment levels be made public. League tables, and I know people are angry about league tables. Before it was like, you're going to that school and it doesn't matter. And she introduced the idea of choice, which, while everyone can't do it, people could choose where their kids went to school. Home ownership. My parents bought their council house in the 1980s And for the first time, council house tenants could go away and buy their own house.
Yeah.
Armed forces, the armed forces that were on the decline in 1982 changed in their standing and put them back at the center of stage.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind the last thing people had talked about the military was failures in Suez. Transforming the Labour Party, that losing 3 times to Margaret Thatcher ultimately led to New Labour and Tony.
And I think also the decreasing power of the unions.
Yes.
Which she.
So, I mean, there's this list of things.
Yeah.
And the one I put at the very end, again, just to lighten the tone a little bit, the rise of power dressing. Margaret Thatcher was the first power dresser. So really, really, really fascinating character. Love her or hate her, and you can do one or both. I think the one thing that you cannot argue against is a massive influencer, a massive impact on the government, who was facing challenges, as I said at the very beginning, which frankly we hadn't seen since World War II. And while you can talk about the things that you don't agree with, actually there's a huge amount. And just the fact that she went from previous government with 30 people through that period in the cabinet, one of which was a woman, to go to become the first female prime minister, the first woman to go to battle since Elizabeth I, actually an incredibly important woman, and an incredibly important leader in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and I think we started by saying, context is important, recognising the difficulty of the position that country and the world, the change the world was going through with the opening up of trade, and from 1978 to when did she finish? 1997.
I'm going to say. I'm going to get that right.
No, because
it's earlier.
John Major was in power in 97, so early 90s. During that period, we saw 1.5 billion people lifted out of poverty, mostly in Asia, mostly in China, because of this offshoring of manufacturing, because of effectively the levelling up of the third world. A huge amount of change, which undeniably is a good thing globally, but creates huge problems, pressures, and change in the first world, in the rich world. And counterfactual histories are not that helpful, and what could have been and what would have happened, I don't think is worth necessarily getting into. But recognising the scale of the challenge, scale of the uncertainty, and the range of difficulties that she faced, undeniable that, as you said, a key influencer who will go down in history as, her legacy as one of greatest prime ministers. And I mean greatest not necessarily in a positive way, but just in terms of what she achieved.
Impact, achievements,
And you can certainly draw lessons about the way she handled situations. Whether you agree with the politics, whether you agree with the outcomes, her approach was very consistent. And there are definitely really interesting parallels with other leaders, other ways that you can approach problems. We've talked about strategy and the uncertainty and the attainment of goals under those conditions of uncertainty. She was a strategist, but I heard somebody talking about her not that long ago, and they said she quite often would ignore the status quo, ignore the current sort of zeitgeist around what was a good idea, and was a deep analyst. She had convictions based on what she thought was right. And she was described as a great strategist who then applied tactics precisely. And what I mean by that is she knew the change she wanted to create. She knew the problems. And then at every step of the way, she was in the weeds of the detail. And I think that is where you don't often see that. You often see big thinkers who are strategists and they let the system kind of work out the detail. Or you see detailed people and they get mired in bureaucracy and they fail to see the wood for the trees. She was able to do both. So I'm still, I think, on the fence as to whether she was wonderful or terrible. I think in some ways she was a brilliant leader, and the legacy she has left is certainly one of the...
Maybe a different way of saying it is her ability to lead and to generate an outcome, I think, arguably very successful.
Yes.
Whether you agree with the outcomes or not, that is a very different...
I think that's a far more pithy and eloquent way of saying what I was rambling on about. But yes, absolutely.
Good. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. That was it was another one which is, we are lazy because we have our decisions and our views about people. And actually, the more you dig in, the more you see nuance and the more you see something else. So I hope you enjoyed that, everyone. I hope we haven't left too many people angry because either we didn't say she was as wonderful as you think we should have done, or on the contrary, you didn't think we said she was as terrible as you should do. But hopefully we focused on the leadership aspects and that shone through.
Cool. Great. Well, we'll now get back into doing these weekly and releasing new episodes every week, and we'll get some guests on. If you have enjoyed that, and whether you agree or disagree with our sort of analysis, let us know. Yeah,
definitely tell us.
We're on X at Battling with Biz, and we are available on email at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. But for now, thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See you next time.